From the book Donkey Bells, Advent and Christmas, Stories, Traditions, and Meditations by Doherty. Section 3, Stories. How we love stories. Why are they so powerful in helping us understand and remember deep truths about life? Isn't it because stories are closer to life than mere ideas? Jesus knew this. He, the master teacher, told the most beautiful and the most unforgettable stories in the history of the world. They are so deep that they now are woven into the very fiber of our hearts and minds. Quote, "In all this teaching to the crowds, Jesus spoke in parables. In fact, he never spoke to them without a parable." Unquote. Matthew 13, verse 34. Stories then are simply another way of sharing the understanding of the gospel with others. That is why Jesus often spoke in story form. From the very beginning of my apostolic life, I have used stories, and they have been understood and loved by young and old alike. I still continue to speak in stories. They come naturally to me. I have found, living in this sophisticated technological generation of today, that the hearts of people still yearn for stories, for explanation of things wrapped up in symbols which are simple yet somewhat mysterious. When I was a child, my mother and father taught me by stories. Because I had traveled much during my childhood, these stories were in many languages, and many of them were taken from the folklore of the pilgrims and peasants. Yes, I come from a country and a generation that listened, an oral generation in many ways, one that transmitted its lore, history, and traditions through stories and parables. Most every family has its own tradition of stories that have been told and retold by generations. Some of those stories really happened to the parents or grandparents or distant ancestors. Other stories are beautiful legends or folklore of the nationality to which the family belongs. These stories flow from the lives and adventures of people on pilgrimage in search of God. The stories are true because their message is true. The rest must be left to the heart of each reader. Whether factual or legendary, these stories should truly be cherished because they are the very soul of a family's tradition and continuity. They help to create and perpetuate a close family feeling between young members and older ones, and between all living family members and those who have gone before them to their eternal rest. Through traditional family stories, these ancestors live once again in the bosom of the family. Perhaps your family has a story or two that you can tell to one another. It may be a humorous story, or one with religious significance. Children love stories, and even adults rarely tire of hearing a good tale well told. In today's world, it costs little to tell a story, simply some family time together. The Christmas Gift. The following story took place when Catherine was living and working in the slums of Toronto in the 1930s at the First Friendship House. She was assisted by Franciscan tertiaries, who were lay people following in the footsteps of St. Francis of Assisi. Today, such people are called Third-Order Franciscans, or members of the secular Franciscan order. Catherine herself was such a tertiary, and she and her workers at Friendship House helped transient people whom Catherine always called the Brothers Christopher. Settle back now and listen as Catherine tells us the tale of a long-ago Christmas. Catherine begins. Outside, the late October evening was dark and stormy. Snow and sleet fell on almost deserted streets. The north wind seemed to take delight in squeezing itself into all the crevices and holes the houses possessed. The big front room of Friendship House was warm and cozy. The Quebec heater roared contentedly, its big belly filled to the top with glowing warm coals. The large kettle on its top sang its happy song invitingly and reminded everyone that here was nice tea to be had at any time. Around the large table full of Catholic magazines and newspapers were sitting several workers who had dropped in to get the latest news. Others were wandering around the bookshelves that covered the four walls, inspecting, looking for some good book to take home with them. At a large desk, one of the tertiaries was deeply engrossed in writing an article, and the uneven noise of the typewriter blended with the wind and storm, and the roaring heater made the place more alive. From the next room, a kitchen, came the clatter of teacups and the subdued laughter of other tertiaries who were preparing a little lunch for the study group, which could be heard occasionally discussing sociology and liturgy. The whole picture was quiet and peaceful. Suddenly, the front door opened with a wrench, letting in a blast of cold air, snow, and rain, and the dark figure of a man stood for a moment, framed against the outside darkness, almost a part of it. Then, slamming the door with a bang, he riveted his eyes on a large crucifix before which burned dimly a little red votive lamp. "Another hellhole of a Christian place," the man shouted. "Just my luck. I have been thrown out of 3 tonight, and I am sick, tired, cold, and hungry. I was told that there was a communist hall this way, and I had to land here instead." Quietly, the tertiary who had been typing stood up, a tall figure in a simple brown dress with a silver crucifix gleaming dully in the light. Smilingly, she advanced toward the man, and stretching out her hand said, "It might be a hellhole, for we are very poor and have little to offer. It is a Christian place also, but we will not tell you to leave. On the contrary, we welcome you to stay with us as long as you need. Forgive our poverty and share what God in his mercy has seen fit to send us. I am sure he guided you to us. The communist hall is only a few steps down." With these words, she approached the man. He looked a little bewildered, then he took a deep breath and collapsed at her feet. Everyone helped to raise him, and he was quickly taken upstairs, where a tertiary brother helped him to a warm bath and gave him some dry clothes, for all he had was a jersey, a pair of trousers, and some old tennis shoes, and these were soaked. Clean and warm, he came down to a nice warm lunch prepared quickly for him, but he remained sullen and silent. From the few disjointed sentences he muttered, the tertiaries understood that he was a transient, that he had overstayed his 24-hour city ticket, and therefore was not entitled any more to either food or shelter at the city hostels, and had to move on. Yet in his flimsy garment, and with the coming storm, he had tried the private agencies, but they were either full or had so much red tape attached to their admission that he gave up, and in the last one he expressed himself rather forcefully, and had simply been thrown out. So he had continued wandering. He was looking for a communist shelter, first because he called himself a communist, and secondly because he knew that, quote, "they wouldn't throw even a dog out in such weather," unquote. Without commenting, the tertiaries listened to this short, disjointed, yet pitiful tale. They had learned from long and bitter experience that in such cases little would be achieved by words, and more by silence and prayer. Seeing his utter exhaustion, they advised him to go to sleep and discuss things more fully on the morrow. Tomorrow came, but the man sat sullen and silent in his corner. Only his dark eyes were alive, observing all that was going on. In the light of day he appeared slight, with an intellectual face, young, not over 30. The tertiaries left him alone all day, and only smiled encouragingly as they passed by. Toward the evening he stepped up to one of them and wanted to know what he was supposed to do in exchange for his shelter and food. "Nothing," answered the woman. "Nothing, my friend. You are a guest of St. Francis here. We are only his humble servants. There is nothing you have to do. Just rest and get strong. Look for work, or let us look for you. Everything in this place belongs to you and your brothers, the Christophers, Christ-bearers of our great roads. We are only stewards of this place, and our greatest privilege is to help and serve people like you. If at any time you want a part in our lives and want to help us to help others like you, let us know and we will find some work for you to do, but there is no obligation of any kind." The man did not answer, but once again an expression of astonishment and childish bewilderment passed across his face. Days merged into weeks, and still John, he had given no other name, and none was asked of him, sat quietly in his corner, a silent listener to all the discussions and conversations that were continually taking place at Friendship House. Intensely he observed how the tertiaries dealt with the many clients of St. Francis, who came in an endless stream, begging for food, clothing, moral and material help. Occasionally he smiled a funny, angry, crooked smile when someone would suggest praying for the coffee that was getting low, or asking St. Francis to send coal, which was badly needed. Yet little by little, as the coffee came and the coal arrived, the smile vanished from his face to be replaced by a puzzled look of concentration, as if he were trying to understand something that eluded his mind. At the beginning of the 3rd week, he sat before the tertiary's desk and resolutely told her that, since he was a communist, he desired to attend their meetings, and would she object to it? Sorrowfully, she lifted her face and answered, "No, you can do what you want, John. I will only ask you never to discuss what you hear there with anyone here during my absence. It wouldn't be fair to the others, would it?" He agreed that it would not, and that he would not do so. From that time on, he was often absent half of the day, but he was always home for supper, after which the tertiaries would ask him what he had heard that day at his communist meetings. He would answer, and there would start a long discussion, point by point, of the Catholic views as opposed to those of communism. Catholic papers would come out, and books would be piled high on the table, in substantiation of this point or that. John ceased to be silent. He became the center of all conversations, stimulating others and arguing with them, drawing all present into the fray. One day he carried away a bunch of Catholic papers that dealt with a social question being discussed, and informed everybody at large that he was, quote, taking a few papers to my friends the communists because they need broadening out, unquote. There's a lot of sense to the encyclicals, and they'd better hear some of it, he said. On this remark, he slammed the door and left, leaving everyone a little dizzy at the prospect of a communist teaching the encyclicals of the popes to another group of communists, but the ways of God are incomprehensible to man. A few days later, on a Sunday, while the tertiaries were bemoaning the absence of one of their group, which made them short-handed for the sale of the Catholic paper at the church door, John cheerfully offered to replace him. A few moments later, John was lustily calling out, "Buy a Catholic paper! Help us to do Catholic action to offset communist and atheist action!" He whistled a joyful tune on the way home and saw nothing out of the way in his method of action, dismissing all thanks with a "one good turn deserves another." During that time, John, of his own volition, took in hand the distribution of work to those of the brothers Christopher who evinced a desire to help. Soon the house shone like a jewel, windows were polished, floors scrubbed, and the cook wore a happy smile because of some new cheap recipe John had dug up. The dishwashers were through in half the time, thanks to a new soap solution he invented. Everyone agreed he was efficient, and he smilingly called it his communist technique. The tertiaries just as smilingly answered that he had become Catholic after a while. Once, when the place was empty of visitors and friends, he asked a tertiary why they devoted their lives to the poor when they all could have good jobs. Why were they living in the slums when their families had lovely homes? Why this simple hospitality, which asked no questions nor any return? Why this eternal begging for others, so hard and so difficult? Gently the tertiary looked into his eyes and slowly answered, "Today's are tragic days when people have forgotten God, and because of that, some who still remember him have left their homes and friends to live among the needy and poor. They come to help them, to share with them their life of hardship, to atone for the rich who have forgotten their brothers and sisters, the poor, who must carry the heavy load which the greed and injustice of their fellow men have thrust upon them. Not all are called to a life like this, but those who have this vocation are privileged and rich beyond the dreams of men, for they do it out of love of Christ, whom they see in the poor and downtrodden. It's all really very simple, and so very wonderful." For a moment both remained silent. Then John told her that he was born a Catholic, and that he had a brother who was a priest. At an early age he had left home and wandered to many places, but he'd always kept his faith until he began to work for a selfish Catholic employer whose greed made hundreds of his workers miserable and unhappy. Watching all this, John had lost his faith and had joined the Communist Party. As John finished speaking, he suddenly jumped up, grabbed his hat, and was gone. That evening many prayers were said for him and for the many tired, lost souls like him. Christmas was coming, and in the hustle and bustle of preparing a little feast for 600 children and a Christmas dinner for the many brothers Christopher, the tertiaries forgot about John a little. Besides, they knew he'd found a job and another place to live, and now visited Friendship House rarely. Christmas Eve came. As everyone was making ready to go to midnight mass, John walked in and announced that he had brought a Christmas present to them, but he would give it later. Everyone thanked him, but suggested that he had not worked long enough to allow himself the luxury of buying Christmas presents. John only smiled. In the rush to get to Mass on time, John was lost sight of. Suddenly in the church, one of the tertiaries excitedly pointed out to the others a man getting out of the confessional. It was John. Astonished and glad beyond words, the tertiaries rendered thanks to God. It was with tears of happiness that they saw John approach the communion rail. Later, on their way home under the starry winter sky, he said, "This is my Christmas present to you. I had ceased to believe in God, but I saw him living and walking again in the Toronto slums. You showed him to me." All remained silent, for they knew what a great miracle had taken place, and that indeed the Christ child had sent them a most wonderful gift. But they had done so little to deserve it. Once more they realized that the ways of God are incomprehensible, and they rendered thanks. Today, John works in a distant northern mining camp. He is a real apostle of Christ, and the spirit of St. Francis lives in him. Many are the souls he has brought back to God. Let us never forget that around us there are thousands of men like John, and that a kind word or a kind gesture might make the difference between a saved soul or a lost one. Let us therefore remember to love our fellow men as St. Francis used to love them, and leave the rest to God's grace. The next story. Christmas without Christ. What was your most memorable Christmas? Was it when you were very little? Was it when you did not have what you wished for at Christmas time? Was it when you were together or apart from your loved ones? Did you have an unexpected guest or event one Christmas? Catherine was once asked about her most memorable Christmas. Her answer is told in the following story. Catherine begins. People talk and write of revolutions, and those who read about them sometimes foolishly wish that they lived in a country and at a time when such exciting events took place, for it all seems packed with great excitement and adventure. But take it from me, who went through one of the most tragic revolutions of history, the communist one in Russia, that there is little excitement in them and less adventure. Revolutions are composed of tiny little things which gather together like many little dark clouds to form a huge black one that blots out the sun and the moon and the stars. This leaves you utterly alone in a darkness so dark that you feel you would give your whole life for just one ray of sunshine. Take streets, for instance. Old, familiar, and beloved streets that you walked all your life. Why, yes, at this corner stood your mother, holding your hand to cross the intersection when you were starting kindergarten. And here is the corner store where you bought candies with the hot, dirty little pennies that you had clutched so carefully all the way from grade school. And there is the familiar alley that you always took from high school because it was a shortcut and because there was a big lilac bush that smelled so nice and made you think of spring and vacations. And a little further was that puppy that you played with, and which now is a nice big woolly dog that still knows you and comes out sedately and slowly to greet you. Would you believe that all these familiar streets which you love and remember from almost babyhood can change overnight into sinister, frightening places where death stalks and life is cheap? Yes, that is just what happened after the communist revolution came to my streets in Petrograd. I was barely 21 when I found out the change. Mother had sent me to see if I could buy some food somewhere. It was early evening. I walked the familiar streets without fear. I loved them, even when they were dark. The electrical power was off in the city due to the revolution. Then I stumbled over something, and when I bent down to see what it was a dead woman with a knife in her back and blood all over the pavement. That was the beginning of the change on my streets. Then the edict went out that anyone found worshiping God in any church could be shot on sight or arrested, and my streets became jungles to be crossed carefully, slowly, hiddenly, hugging the walls of buildings so as to melt with their shadows in the early morning when going to Mass. As soon as that edict went out, church services became the center of all life. How long would it be before there would be no Mass? People asked themselves that question, and the thought froze all Christian hearts. For what is life without Mass, without the sacraments? Men, women, and youth arose and went to Mass daily. So did I. We all went, but we first blessed ourselves in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, because we all knew that maybe this was the last time we might walk the familiar, yet now unfamiliar streets. We walked as Indians must have when stalking their prey, soft-footed, alert, listening for any loud footsteps. Only communists walked loudly through the fearsome streets. We walked in human fear and trembling, but we had to go where we were going, to Mass, to church, because without it we would not be able to face another day of wondering, fearing that it would be our last day. This is another fact about revolutions. They bring eternity into every hour of every day. You peel potatoes in your kitchen, and hark, there are heavy footsteps on the stairs. Are they for you? Are the communist secret police coming to arrest you, or those you love? No, they passed your door. With a trembling hand, you go on peeling potatoes, listening, and wondering about life and death. God is very near then. In fact, God alone matters, and so does the Mass. So we went at dawn like the Christians of old, softly, hugging walls, watching, now melting with the shadows, now moving inch by inch into a dark church. One day it happened. It happened in church. It was an old church with a cold stone floor, without lights, except for the tabernacle light and 2 slender candles. It happened right after the consecration, while the priest's hands were still raised high, to allow us all who were living under a sentence of death, as it were, to behold him who died for love of us, and to give us courage if the need arose, to try to die as gallantly for the love of him. White were the hands of the priest, white was the host, shining white were the candles, dark and dim the church. When suddenly the side door opened with a bang, and rough voices shouted, "Stand still!" The priest froze with the host still lifted high. We became statues of immobility lost in the dimness of the church. Soldiers, for that is who they were, Red Army soldiers. One of them slowly lifted his rifle and slowly took aim. One shot rang out, only one. The priest quivered, swayed, and fell sideways. The consecrated host rolled down the steps onto the floor, coming to rest, still and white, on the dark floor by the altar railing, in 2 pieces. Silence took over, only to be broken and shattered by the rhythmic steps of the hobnailed boots of the soldiers walking toward the tabernacle, then vaulting over the railing. Triumphantly, their voices suddenly rang out while one of them crushed the consecrated host under his heel. "There is no God. We have crushed him." Silence wrapped up his voice and killed it. Silence. The silence of Golgotha entered the church. It hung, even like Christ on the cross, only to be broken again by the thin, reedy voice of an old, old man who spoke from the intense shadows of the church. "Father, forgive them, even if they know what they do." The silence came back once more, a new silence of mercy and pardon. The Red Army soldiers shivered a little and slowly slunk away through the sacristy. Their hobnailed boots made dragging sounds that were like a dirge. A door slammed in the back. A moan went through the church, our moan of pain and horror. Slowly the old man arose. He was a patriarchal figure with a long white beard and flowing hair. Reverently he gathered the crushed pieces of the consecrated host. Slowly he bade us to come forward and to receive them in our last communion, maybe our viaticum. We did. Then we got holy water and scrubbed the floor, and we stayed on to pray in reparation. We buried the priest secretly. He was the last priest in town. There would be no mass, no sacraments. The familiar streets were still filled with danger and death for us. We didn't mind them anymore because we ourselves were filled with such desolation, a desolation that no one knows in countries where there are so many churches and so many priests. All this happened just before Christmas, and so it was a Christmas without Christ in the tabernacle, without Mass, without confession, without communion. Just the same, it was my most memorable Christmas. Since they had closed all the doors against his coming, he chose the humble stables of our pain-filled hearts in which to be born anew, that strange, lonely, cold Christmas of the first year of the communist Russian Revolution in 1917. Sometimes it seems to me to have been the most blessed Christmas of all, because from that day on, I knew that when all the rest had been taken away from me, nothing mattered but his inner presence in my heart. I wish, oh, how I wish, that I could really tell all this to all the youth in North America. To so many of them, going to Mass on Sunday seems at times too dull and hard. Mass on Sunday? Oh, my friends, go to Mass every day while you can. Yes, we would have crawled on our knees that Christmas through the strange and fearsome streets filled with dangers and death, if only we could have participated in just one more Mass. Thank God each day that as yet your most memorable Christmas is not without Christ in all the tabernacles of your many churches. How Pride Became Humble. The story below is a parable, one of many that Catherine made up on the spot as she was nursing a guest who stayed for a while at Madonna House. The guest was a young contemplative monk whose doctor had advised a change of environment for several months. After a spell of sickness, when the guest was resting, he would say, "Tell me a story." This is one of the stories Catherine told him just before he fell asleep. Catherine begins. Lady Pride was born proud. She never remembered a time when she had not been filled with an overwhelming admiration for herself. She passed through the ages brimful with arrogance, like people who are sure that they are better, more clever, and in every way superior to others. She always held her beautiful head very high, and she walked slowly, majestically, across the centuries. She did not bother to deal with each person to the same degree. While she influenced all, she chose her select company very carefully. If she liked someone, she'd come and stay with that person for a long, long time, and everyone would soon see her influence. People imitated her quite well. They, like her, became cold, aloof, and unapproachable, behaving as if they were set apart somehow, and were above the common lot of humans. Despite her disposition, she was quite beautiful. Her beauty could not be denied. She was tall and stately, and with features that could be called classical by those who know about such things. Yet people, by and large, were afraid of her and of her beauty. There was something about it that was evil, dark, sinister. It reminded them of deep, still, stagnant waters, greenish in color, that could not sustain life, but only killed it. All living things died in such waters. Anyone who has traveled can observe the desolate landscapes created by such waters. Gray, lifeless trees lift their leafless arms to heaven as if crying out from strange depths. The shores are bereft of flowers or grass. They are covered only with sand and rocks. Water plants refuse to take root. Such waters are dead, dead and frightening. It was of such scenes that people thought whenever they saw Lady Pride pass by. They shivered and turned away, and yet they knew that she often showered her gifts upon her friends. Gold and silver seemed to be hers to give. Power followed in her wake, but it was a darksome power, and it only served her and her friends, those who were slaves to her whims. Lady Pride often recalled her many conquests. In one event she took special pride. It had happened a long time ago, perhaps on or near the day she was born. It had been an extraordinary day, for she never remembered ever having been young on that day or any other. She had been born mature. It was the day on which God, He who is, had revealed His secret to the angels. After He had revealed it to them, they were all enthralled, and they remained very, very still. Lady Pride had not heard the secret herself, but she saw one beautiful spirit, who seemed all light, begin to frown. He was so beautiful that she desired to be with him forever. She walked softly over to him and whispered to him that, whatever the secret was, it was not for him, for she saw that he did not like what he had heard. Why should he accept? He was, she convinced him, as great as God himself. The angel of light turned, saw her, and believed what she said. Then, rising to an immense height, he shouted for all to hear the motto of Pride, Non serviam, I will not serve. Many of the lesser angels joined him after they, too, had looked at Lady Pride. There ensued a battle that rocked the heavens. For once Lady Pride put aside her dignity and joined in the battle on the side of Lucifer, the angel of light. Suddenly, in the midst of the battle, she stood still. She beheld an awesome and frightening thing. Light was leaving the angel of light, and darkness was entering into him. His beauty remained, but now it was a dark beauty, the beauty of deadliness, a travesty of all beauty. One contact with it spelled death forever. Immediately, Lucifer and his armies fell down, 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 into depths that Lady Pride had never known to exist. She followed them, but she could not remain in hell. She was earthly as well as hellish. As the centuries rolled on, she would go back to hell now and then for a visit. Satan still fascinated her. But she liked to remain on the earth, where she allowed herself to be used by Satan whenever he wished. Perhaps that is another reason why people are always afraid of her. Who can tell? Maybe, too, they remembered her part in the fall of their first parents. Naturally, Lady Pride was there, too, in the garden with the snake. It seemed as if her sole purpose of existence was to extend the awful domain of the angel of light, the one who had become now the prince of darkness. One starry night, Lady Pride was walking in her slow, majestic fashion. She paused now and then to admire her own reflection in the various lakes, rivers, and pools that dotted her way. She found herself on the outskirts of a small village, the entrance to which was a narrow path. On both sides of the path were caves, dug into the sandy rock which covered the countryside. One cave especially attracted her attention. It seemed to cast a blinding light onto the path. A great star hovered over it, almost touching the roof. Lady Pride drew closer, pausing now and then as if afraid to get too close. The wooden door of the cave was full of chinks and holes. It was just an old stable door. The cave was used, it seemed, only to house animals. Lady Pride was, for once, unsure of herself, and strangely troubled. Then slowly she opened the door, not really expecting to see anyone. On the contrary, she saw a woman holding a child in her arms, and there was a man kneeling in seeming adoration. The man got up and made a step or two toward the door as if to bar the way, but the woman shook her head gently, so the man stopped. Lady Pride entered and gently closed the door behind her. The woman, a mere child herself, seemed to grow taller and more mature as she held up the child and sang this song of praise. My soul praises the Lord. My soul is glad because of God my Savior, for he has remembered me, his lowly servant, and from now on all people will call me blessed. Lady Pride fell on her knees. Suddenly she knew that this was the sight that God had shown the angels on the day she was born. She had not seen it then. She had only seen the frown of Lucifer, the prince of pride. It was this child she had counseled him not to serve. With her head in the straw which littered the floor, Lady Pride wept. She wept bitter, scalding tears of sorrow and compunction. She wished she were dead. She wished she had never been born. She wished she had never seen Lucifer or spoken to him. The enormity of her offense stood out so clearly that she was blinded by the sight. But the lady with the child was smiling again, and though Lady Pride did not hear any words spoken, she knew that she had been forgiven, and that henceforth she would never be the same. She had beheld with her own eyes the fullness of truth incarnate, God made flesh, God and his mother, and that is how Lady Pride became humble. Today she takes pride only in the works of God, especially those wonders of grace he accomplishes in the hearts of men. Lucifer wept too, but with anger. He picked up haughtiness, which Lady Pride had left on the straw of the cave, and he made it his own. Thus it is today that when people see a cold and haughty beauty walking the earth, one who puts on a great arrogance and an insufferable pride, they see a ghostly reflection of the heart of Lucifer, the angel of light, who became the prince of darkness. The Bruised Reed. The following story is a Christmas fable written by Jude Fisher, a staff worker of Madonna House. It is one of a collection of stories excerpted from her book, Be Always Little. Once there was a reed, tall and proud, growing near a stream. He was a fine reed indeed, and how he loved life. He lived every moment to the full. From his height he had a splendid view of the whole area. He watched the small animals scampering to and fro, the birds darting here and there, the multi-hued insects, the fish gliding in the stream. Best of all, he liked the flowers. They came in a never-ending parade of exquisite form and color. Old friends would go, but new ones promptly followed, and delighted him so that he never stopped to wonder what happened to the old. And all the while he stood tall and green. Yes, life was good indeed. One morning he awoke, and as he looked into the stream he discovered that his tip was turning brown. His dismay grew as day after day the malady spread until his fine green coat was completely gone. Not only that, he began to feel dry, then drier and drier. The rains came and beat at him, the wind battered him, and finally a mighty gust snapped him loose from the earth. He lay desolate on the ground, broken, bruised, and heavy-hearted. Some days later a young man came by and picked him up. He put him in his bag. It was black inside, so black that the poor reed could see nothing at all. He longed for the end, for anything but this unending darkness. Finally the day came when the young man took him out of the bag. How good it was to see light again, and he saw fields and rolling hills, and sheep grazing peacefully around. The young man took a sharp knife and cut part of Reed away, hurting him so acutely he couldn't help but cry out. Then the man ruthlessly pierced him through, from end to end, clearing out his hollow. Every inch of his being quivered with pain. Then he was thrust back into the darkness again. Some time later he was taken out. He welcomed the light, yet dreaded the pain he anticipated would come along with it. And sure enough, there was the knife. This time the young man mercilessly cut several holes in him. He wept silently. Then he was plunged once more into blackness. The day came when Reed, from his dark home in the bag, sensed something different, some excitement in the air. The young man joined some other shepherds, and they hurried toward the edge of town. There they went into a cave, and the young man pulled Reed out of the bag. Reed braced himself for the inevitable knife. Instead, to his surprise, he felt only the gentle caress of the young man's hands as he lifted him tenderly to his lips. Then the young man poured his life's breath into him, and there came forth from Reed a beautiful song, simple and pure. And as Reed sang, he looked out and saw a young mother and her little baby, and they smiled at him. Quote, "The people walking in darkness have seen a great light," unquote. Isaiah 9, verse 1. A Woman, a Child, and Christmas. Many stories that Catherine told were true. They were actual incidents taken from her years of living and working with the poor, first in Toronto, then in New York's Harlem section, in Chicago and other cities. She called these her Blue Door stories, since the doors of Friendship House, and later on Madonna House, were always painted blue in honor of Our Lady. This lovely custom comes from an old Russian saying that every front door painted blue in honor of Our Lady brings blessings on all who pass through it. The story below was a true happening of God's mercy. what Raissa Maritain, a good friend of Catherine's, would call an adventure in grace. Catherine begins. His shoulders were thin and hunched over, like those of a man who never in his life had a warm coat to shield him against the biting winds. It was as if he had always tried to make himself narrow, so there would be less for the wind to whip around. His face was long, thin, and sort of transparent. His eyes were blank and terrible to behold. He was like a blind man who was seeing. Emptiness, with endless frightened depths, could be found in those eyes if you looked long enough, but few bothered. He made his way to the Quebec heater in the middle of our big room. Taking off his hat, he twisted it absent-mindedly in his hands, which were extended toward the pleasant heat of the strong fire. The men looked up from their game of cards, or from their newspapers and magazines. All sort of nodded or smiled. He did not seem to notice. He just stood there, twisting his hat as before, hunching his thin shoulders, and warming himself. I got up and made my way to the man. I asked if he was hungry. He nodded yes, as if he was too tired to speak. I led him to the back room, our kitchen, and placed some food before him. He sat down. He ate wolfishly, as one who needed food desperately. Then suddenly he wept, with deep, racking sobs that foretold the rushing waters of a dam about to break. I sat still. The pain of Christ encompassed me as it had for years. Thousands like him who had come through the blue door had brought his pain to me, to us, that we might take it away from them and take it into ourselves. That is what loving the neighbor really means, becoming the bearer of their cross of pain, sorrow, and need. Then just as suddenly as he had begun to cry, he began to speak. The story he told was a simple one, sordid and old, yet somehow poignant, new, full of pain. For when a story is connected with a human being, with real life, it is never old, or sordid, or simple. He had married much too young. She became pregnant. He in turn became frightened of the poverty all around them. He abandoned her. That was 6 months ago. After that he found that he could not live with himself. He went back because she was alone, young, and defenseless. All around about was the Great Depression. No jobs, but he had returned too late. She had vanished and left no trace, at least none that he could follow. After that he did not care. He became a sort of bum, riding the rails, but always in search of her, his abandoned wife, and the child. The baby should by now be several weeks old. Where was she? Where were they? On this Christmas Eve, the feast of babies and of mothers. He lay slumped, his head in pieces of bread and peanut butter, the upset bowl of soup trickling its contents onto his thin overcoat and onto his tightly clenched hands. A naked heart is difficult to look at. I left him for a while. Later I saw him warming himself by the stove. His eyes were dry again. Slowly the place emptied out. It was Christmas Eve. One by one the tired and weary, the young and old, the poor and destitute, and those who had become poor for love of them, all were going to midnight mass in a nearby church. The young man with the empty eyes did not move, so I decided to stay and share his loneliness and his emptiness. There was always the morning mass to go to. A strange, hushed silence settled upon us. I put out most of the lights and put on the lights of the big Christmas tree that stood by our large window. The place looked a little bit like a chapel with its votive lamp and Christmas lights. Then I lit the lonely candle in the other window as a welcome to wayfarers, another custom of my faraway country. Still the young man did not move. Slowly I began my rosary. What else could I do before the silent drama of a man's soul on this holy night but pray? The snow was falling fast and heavy. Hurrying passers-by were but shadows outside the warm circle of our room. Without warning, the door opened. A woman with a baby wrapped in a shawl stood there, framed like a picture, the snowflakes on her melting quickly in the heat. I stood up to greet her, but the young man was quicker. He had turned and had seen her. He almost jumped the space that separated them. She was quickly in his arms. He was repeating the woman's name over and over again. The baby began to cry. Then everything was silent. The statue of the Blessed Virgin with the votive lamp flickering on her face seemed to come alive. The silence was profound. Then the bells of the church nearby rang out their glad news of the birth of the child. The thin man with the hunched shoulders had found her whom his heart was seeking. I gently closed the blue door the woman had left open in her excitement, and I went into the kitchen to finish my rosary. First Christmas in Combermere. Catherine and Eddie Doherty came to Combermere in the spring of 1947. Their first winter there was a difficult one, with much snow and cold weather, long before others came to join them, save for Grace Flewelling, or Fluey as she was called. That first Christmas at Madonna House was a memorable one for them despite the hardships. For anyone without the means to buy expensive gifts or food for their loved ones, this story is an inspiration. Catherine tells what it was like in her account below. Catherine begins, "The first Christmas of Madonna House was in 1947, and Lady Poverty dwelt with us in her all-shining reality. Madonna House then was just a little 6-room house with no outbuildings except for an outdoor toilet. It stood rather lonely in what then was a huge 5-acre expanse of white, sparkling snow. Nature provided us with many splendid evergreens to decorate the house, which we did, with fragrant greens and a freshly cut Christmas tree. But absent were the usual shining baubles, the kind that bring delight to the hearts of children, both the real ones and the ones whose heads might be gray with age. There were just Eddie, myself, and Fluey, our first staff worker here. Fluey's hands worked wonders with the little humble things that we had for decorating our tree, which stood in the corner of the little room with the fireplace overlooking the river. A few walnuts had been donated to us, about a pound or so, and Fluey, who was an artist, painted them with some old gold and silver paint which she'd brought with her from Harlem. We put hairpins into them and hung them on the tree with black threads. Fluey then cut a roll of donated tin foil into artistic shapes, mostly liturgical symbols such as the infant and his mother, St. Joseph, oxen, donkeys, and stars. Those we hung on the tree too. A few other little donated odds and ends we fashioned into ornaments and topped it off with candles, since we had no electric lights. I was reminded of our trees in Russia, which were always lit with candles. There is nothing to replace the soft, wonderful glow of candles, as long as one is careful and watchful of them. Fluey's ingenuity and the lovely fresh greens, little bits of ribbon and whipped-up snow made from soap, completed our decor. I think we did very well, although decorating in the usual fancy, delightful Christmas style we were accustomed to is impossible. Fluey took the china crucifix and made a lovely display, putting in a little statue of the Madonna with a baby in her arms, which we had around the house. Then she lit a votive light before it. In its soft glow, the tender little bit of tinsel we'd found in a carton just glowed, and its bluish silver color came out, giving the whole room a real Christmas feeling. Since I am reminiscing, I'll tell you the story of that Italian china crucifix, the one that still stands today over the fireplace. I used to work at a large department store in Toronto, in its gift shop, which was a place of bedlam at Christmas time, a place where sales clerks got tired to the point of exhaustion. I was unwrapping things in the stockroom when I came to that crucifix. It slipped from my tired fingers and broke in a couple of pieces. You can still see the breakage. Christmas spirit or no Christmas spirit, the head of the department charged me the full price, $25. It was taken out of my $12.50 salary, on which lived a sick husband and a little baby, not counting myself, at $1 per week for 25 weeks. We all felt the tremendous sting of that missing dollar, but since I was paying for it in full, the crucifix was given to me, forever a memorial of God's grace in allowing me to participate in his poverty on the cross and his pain. Fluey and I made wreaths. They were very simple, and we decorated them with pine cones, painted laboriously with some donated red, green, and white paint. Those were the only decorations for that first Christmas, but words cannot express how great was the love that went into it. How tremendous that first Christmas was when, after our humble but loving preparations, we went off to midnight mass, walking across the road to the church on a starry night that was rather cold. The crunching snow was a song in our ears. Sweetly it sang its carols to us. The ice on the river reflected the stars, and the snow reflected thousands of sparkling stars. As we approached the church, which was softly lighted with kerosene lamps and candles, it glowed like a jewel in the night, and the sound of the choir singing carols greeted us. It was a mass I'll never forget, because it was a mass of joy and great thanksgiving for the gift of the vocation, for the coming of poverty, for the sharing in the life of those we had come to serve, and for the beauty round about us, and the charity of God and his tenderness. It was wonderful to return home and to have our little collation, the Christmas foods that had been laid out on a table in the little library. As we ate, the logs in the fireplace were crackling and singing their carols too. We had no turkey, we had no goose, we had no ducks, not even a roast with Yorkshire pudding. We had hamburgers and French fried potatoes warmed in the oven, and a little plum pudding that I had made, just enough for 3. There was no wine, so we drank tea, but I think all three of us were drunk with joy and gratitude and love. The gifts we exchanged were nothing in themselves, silly little funny things, but lovingly wrapped in beautiful parcels, as beautiful as our love for one another could make it. We didn't have many items of clothing, so we took from the second-hand pile a sweater not too much worn, a pair of socks for Eddie without too many holes, a warm shirt for him, and some warm underwear for us. All had been washed, cleaned, and wrapped up very well. The wrapping was our little carol of love to one another, since the rest was given by Our Lady through the charity of others. We had great joy and much laughter opening our gifts. Fluey received a brooch, not very new, in the shape of a teapot, because she was always going around saying, "That last meal we had was not very filling. How about filling our tummies with a nice hot strong cup of tea?" She sure was a great tea drinker. And the little brooch she gave me was in the shape of a kitchen spoon. I laughed until tears rolled down my cheeks because I was forever stirring up some gook or other, a creative mixture of unknown leftovers. And we gave Eddie a little 1-inch hatchet because in those days he was dealing with the splitting and carrying of wood. I think amidst our laughter we were very mature that moment, for we were very childlike and simple, and the spirit of Madonna House with its love for little things was palpable and could have been touched at that moment on that first Christmas, like a living thing, like a living flame among us. This is how traditions and family customs are established, out of something intangible, out of laughter, out of a joyous minute or hour, out of the wonderment of a human soul at the tremendous gift of childlikeness. That state of soul, that state of mind, that state of emotion is a gift of God. This is His way of making thin the veil of faith. This is His tender manner of bringing us to Bethlehem, to the manger, to the stupendous, awesome mystery of Jesus Christ, God made man. Your family may not have much this Christmas, but the ingenuity of love, the joy of giving yourselves, each to the other, will far outshine any silly baubles bought with money alone. For the love of Christ is what Christmas is all about, and loving one another will please the infant inestimably more than any other gift you could possibly dream of. We didn't have much for ourselves that Christmas in Combermere, but we had been able to beg a few gifts for our neighbors, though we didn't know many of them the first year here. The closest families to us received our humble, begged gifts of love. Yes, it was a good Christmas, that first Christmas at Madonna House. The Little Christmas Angel Orion. The tale below was written by master storyteller Eddie Doherty. This warm Irish yarn is read to the Madonna House family a few days before Christmas, when there are always guests present. Eddie begins. 'Tis a story the Irish, and them of Irish blood, tell their children on Advent nights, when the stars shine brightest and little eyes grow biggest with the wonder of the Christ child's borning. 'Tis the story of the angel Orion, a wee cherub, not long from his mother's milk, and as holy and zealous and curious a spirit as any newly ordained priest, aye, and just as ignorant of the world. Some hold that he was called after the star Orion, the great constellation venerated by race after race of ancient savages. But there are others, and their name is Legion, who insist that his mother, God rest her soul, who was guardian angel to the Orions and Donegal, had named him after one of the clan. Be that as it may, the story has it that Orion, within a year of his weaning, was given permission to visit the earth by himself, and to have a look around as part of his angelic education. Sure, 'tis like that in heaven. An angel must travel a bit and talk to people before he amounts to anything. An untraveled angel hasn't a chance up there. The big angels look at him in a funny way. "Bedad," they say, "this one's still wet behind the wings." So Orion kissed his sisters goodbye, packed a bit of lunch, and set off on his great adventure. God must have smiled on him kindly as he watched him go, knowing the love in the tiny cherub's heart. And the Almighty must also have found a great delight in our bold hero, because of the perfection of him. There are those few, it must be admitted, who will have it only one way, that God was so busy planning a greater delight, not only for heaven but for the world as well, that he had no time to witness the angel's flight. But sure there's heresy in that, since God knows everything and loves every creature he has made. Let them quibble who will, there is no doubt of one thing. Orion's heart and soul was filled with the love of God, and his great intention in visiting the earth was to bring back something to the Lord of heaven, something that would make God even happier than he was, which was impossible, of course. But what does an angel know of theology? "Wurra, wurra," the worried angel said to himself as he came closer and closer to the Emerald Isle. "Now what would himself be wanting most from this strange planet? That I must bring him." Scarce had the words said themselves in his mind before he found himself in a bed of shamrocks, and the lights of a cottage shining in his eyes. "Men," he said. He flapped his wings for a minute or two to chase off the dew collected from the shamrocks, and to give himself a dash of courage. Men were beings he had never seen, and he didn't know how to approach them. But sure 'twas nothing for him to walk through the walls and into the house as though there were no walls at all. And there in a crib before the fireplace he saw a baby, and him smiling in his sleep. The angel was transformed on the instant by the sight. Never had he seen such strange beauty. Not even in heaven was there anything just like this. 'Twas a beauty all of earth. Ah, how the good God would enjoy this, he thought. And he was just about to carry the baby's smile up with him to highest heaven, when he became aware of the baby's guardian angel. "Scram," this one said to him, "be off with you now, you little O'Madden, before I lose my temper." Orion was abashed. "I meant no harm, dear sir," he said. "I was just admiring the child I was. It is a child, isn't it? Or maybe it's a woman or a man." The ignorance of the cherub softened the big angel, but it didn't amuse him, as it might have amused a man. "Ah, there now," he said. "I didn't mean to be harsh, nor to be big and important to the likes of you. No, indeed. But I have a job to do, you see. 'Tis I must guard this one and make a man of him if I can. 'Tis I must send up all his smiles and all his good deeds, all the things God wants most from him. And when he dies, 'tis I must bring his soul to heaven, if heaven be open to him at that time." He watched the little angel peering about the room with his bright eyes, and took pity on him. With a few quiet words he put him at ease and gave him the lay of the land. What's more, he introduced him to the angels who were guarding the child's mother and father. Ah, they had a great gossiping, the four of them, discussing the things of heaven and earth. And as Orion set off for other parts of the world, the baby's guardian angel said a strange thing to him. "Merry Christmas," he said. Orion pondered that as he flew through the skies, but couldn't make head nor tail of it. He pondered, too, a significant fact. The angels guarding the baby's parents looked old and haggard and thin, though they weren't a second older than the young fellow guarding the baby. Sure, and it must be a devil of a job guarding the earthlings who had grown out of their babyhood. The guardian angel of the baby's father had actually grown gray. But Orion outdistanced these thoughts the farther he flew. 'Twas a fine night, the stars were glorious, and the wind in his face reminded him of the breath of God. Now what could he bring God? Maybe the sorrow of a dying sinner sorry for his sins. He'd picked up enough of the Irish angels' lingo to learn about sins and sinners, and God's love for them as they repent, even in the moment of their dying. But where was he to find a repentant sinner? The Irish said they existed only in Ireland. Nowhere else in the world were there people who sinned so boldly, they said, or repented so violently. Sure, nowhere else in the world did a sinner repent at all. The situation was so acute in the rest of the world that some of the angels had been talking of a sit-down strike. "Wurra, wurra," Orion said again and again. "'Twould be a fine thing to find one of those sinners, and his angel on strike. 'Twould be a fine thing to make him repent and bring his clean soul up to limbo to await the happy day. Glory be to God," he said to himself all of a sudden. "Merry Christmas, that's what the angel means. Oh, sure, 'tis Christmas Eve, and what with the excitement of the trip and all, I clean forgot." He looked at the stars, and saw that he still had time to dip down to this country and that in quest of a dying sinner, and this he did in nation after nation. In Spain he found a man dying in a palace, with gold pieces all around him, and things hammered and bent and molded out of gold, and beset with rubies and emeralds and diamonds. But the man's angel was there with him, and he scoffed at the words of the Irish angels. "Ah, 'tis the way of them all," he told Orion. "The more those angels see of the Irish, the more Irish they themselves become. 'Tis exaggerating they were, telling you of a sit-down strike. Bedad, there's good and bad in men of all lands. And an angel that knows his business has always a chance. Even with the worst of them he has a chance, and he never lays down on the job. Be off with you now, for I'm in my busiest hour. It wasn't enough that this poor soul given me to guard should be steeped in corruption, but he's steeped in riches too, and it's the gold that's worrying me. It'll drag him down to the deepest pit of hell if I can't lift the weight of it off him." Orion looked at the face of the dying sinner and at the gold. He shrugged his wings. "If I could be of any help," he offered, not as if he meant it, of course, but only out of politeness. The other angel shook his head. "Where there's much gold," he said, "only God himself can be of any help. Be on your way, little one, and a Merry Christmas." "The same to you," said Orion, "and many of them." He was over North Africa when he looked at the stars again and saw that he would have to hurry, and hurry he did. He was still far from the town of Bethlehem when he heard the angel chorus singing of peace on earth. But with all his hurry, he stopped to bless himself, like the good Catholic he was. And then he hurried twice as fast. Sure, he hurried so fast that, what with the friction of the wind and the excitement of getting there on time, he began to shine like a great star, and as everybody knows, he got there just above the stable in the very nick of time, so that his shining glory would do honor to the child just born. Never was an angel happier in all eternity, up to this moment, than Orion, hovering over the stable in Bethlehem, listening to his fellow angels singing, and watching the shepherds leave their flocks to come and adore. Glory be to God, he thought to himself, puzzled-like. I never was happier in heaven itself. He watched the shepherds go one by one into the stable, and he bade each and every one of them a Merry Christmas. But they didn't answer him. Sure, and they were bewildered creatures, what with the singing of the angels and the message they had brought to earth, and the splendor of Orion blazing like a great star just overhead. 'Twas dumbfounded they were, besides their bewilderment. At last there came a shepherd holding a little girl by the hand, a pretty little girl with hair so red that it shone even in the dark. Merry Christmas, Orion said to her. He said it a little bashfully, not as he had said it to the men. He had seen men, but until now he had never beheld the beauty of a little girl. So naturally he was bashful. Hearing his voice, the little girl looked up and smiled at him. Come see the baby, she bade him. Sure, Orion was just waiting for some such invitation, and with no more ado he dropped down through the roof and hovered over the crib in utter joy and amazement. His little heart fair burst with his great love, and a great hunger and thirst to sing hosannas was upon him. But alas, he had never learned to sing. He could only adore in silence. What's the baby's name? The little girl asked the lady, who was seated in the straw, leaning over the child and blessing him with her smile. His name is Jesus, said the lady. The angel's heart hammered and hammered inside him as he heard the name. 'Twas such a beautiful name, and oh, if those angels outside would only hush up their noise and let him hear the lady's voice more clearly. Despite his exultation in all he saw and heard, he was vexed with the angelic choir. How long he remained there, worshipping with all his heart and soul, and feasting his eyes on Mary and Joseph as well as the baby, Orion himself couldn't have told you, but 'twas soon enough he was out in the cold night with the other angels, and them somewhat disgruntled and unlike themselves. Glory be to God, Orion said to the choir later. Now why are you so wry-mouthed and glum on such a night? Ah, now, said the leader, leave it to a cherub to ask impertinent questions. If it wasn't Christmas Day itself, divil an answer I'd be giving you. But if you must know, there was a sour note somewhere. When the daughter of the shepherd went into the stable, the Son of God cared no more for our music than if we were but the wind, and it hissing like a silly goose. I don't think he listened to us after that. He strapped his harp comfortably under his left wing, so it wouldn't bother him in the homeward flight. Now that he's a mortal man, a child is sweeter to him than all the music we can make. It wasn't exactly grumbling they were as they shot up to heaven. 'Twas just letting themselves talk things out. And it wasn't altogether unhappy they felt. 'Twas more like a deep puzzlement that was on them, and a sense of having been inadequate somehow. Orion himself, though no happier angel lived, had no comfort at all in the knowledge that he was going back empty-handed to the throne. Out of all the treasures of earth he had brought nothing. He had no Christmas present of any kind for God. The shame of it began to tear at the overwhelming happiness in his heart, and by the time he stood before the Creator he could only hang his head. The singing angels reported all that had happened, and all heaven rejoiced. Never was the music more divine, never were angels wrapped in such ecstasy, never, it seemed to Orion, peeking through the fingers he had clasped over his eyes, did God's face shine with such majesty and beauty. And there was a little girl with shiny hair, the choir leader said. I know, God answered, and he beckoned Orion to come close to him. You, he said, tell me what happened in the stable. I felt myself in heaven, the wee cherub said simply. I felt at home. But when the lady, his sweet mother, told the little girl his name, I would have died of joy if I could die. His name is Jesus. At that, all heaven was in a delirium of joy. It doubled and trebled its joy 1,000 times. The place rocked with sheer delight. The trumpeter angels blew so loudly into their instruments that they caused tornadoes and whirlwinds and cyclones and wicked storms on earth. The harpists and violinists and piano players and drummers were in such a frenzy of action, on strings and keys and drum heads, that the sun and the moon and all the planets spun round in a cosmic dance. And God reached out and clasped the little angel close to his all-holy breast and hugged him, so that, angel or not, he swooned away like a chit of a girl. Sure, not even St. Michael himself, prince of all the angels and general of all the armies, had ever such great bliss of God. When he came to, Orion listened almost incredulously to God's praises. You have brought me the greatest gift any angel has ever given me. You have brought into heaven the greatest joy since heaven is, the name of my son, Jesus. Go you back now, my beloved child, and for your reward hover brightly over that stable until the wise kings come from the east. Souls you may not bring me, since you are no guardian angel, but men to adore my son you shall draw, with your shining beauty from far-off parts. And he kissed the darling angel on the forehead ere he let him go. 'Tis a story the Irish tell their children on bright nights in Advent, wherever the Irish be. Yet, bedad, it may have happened just as the Irish tell it on that lovely night so long ago. Christmas in Harlem. The last story is true. It is Catherine's account of her experiences one Christmas Eve when she was working at Friendship House in New York City's Harlem section. It will remain one of the mysteries and graces of my life, and a deeply spiritual one at that, she said. This story is best read on Christmas Eve at supper time before midnight mass, for that is when it happened. Catherine begins. It was a sort of upside-down affair that came floating through my memory when I began to write this story. The memory was of a Christmas night. It seemed upside down because no one came through the blue door that night in Harlem. I had just closed it behind the last of our bunch. We had much to finish up before midnight mass. That's when I met the strange trio that I most assuredly did meet that night. They did not go through the blue door, but somehow, and don't ask me how, the blue door was certainly involved. It was a perfectly natural meeting, too, nothing miraculous about it or about anything that followed. And it was a nice meeting, one that made Christmas Mass a little more joyous, and the meditations that followed a little more profound. Just as I was leaving, and had turned from locking the blue door, which had given me some trouble that night, I confess, the key stuck or something, I was confronted by a very handsome Negro man of middle age and a small younger woman. Evidently she was his wife, and she was holding a baby in her arms. I could not see the baby's face. It was all bundled up against the raw New York wind that was blowing into a gale. Very politely, the man lifted his hat, and in the soft accents of the deep South, he told me that he and his wife were lost in this big city. They had just gotten off the train. He was a carpenter, hoping to get a better job than the one he had in the little village they came from. But with one thing and another, they had been delayed en route. They didn't have any money, that is, not quite enough for a night's lodging. Perhaps I could tell them where to go, what to do, and to whom they might apply for help. Having said his piece, he stood relaxed, waiting politely and silently for my answer. His wife, who had never said a word, just smiled once or twice at me. She stood as confident and as still as he, sure that I was just the person to help them. Before my mind's eye came a vision of the telephone. I almost turned back and opened the blue door to try and contact some social agency that would attend to their wants. Then I looked at my wristwatch. It was almost 11 o'clock, and on Christmas Eve. Whom could I find at this time, and where? And if I did, this poor family would have to brave strange subways. I could, of course, send them by taxi. I did have a few extra dollars in my purse, wonder of wonders. But the family shelters of New York will separate families sometimes because of lack of room. Lack of room! Christmas Eve? Man, woman, child! It all suddenly hit me right between the eyes. Of course, I knew it was just a coincidence. Nice in a way. But so many people came to Friendship House just for this kind of help and information. No, this was not the time to send such a family anywhere. This was the time to offer them personal hospitality, if for no other reason than to atone for the hospitality that was not given almost 2,000 years ago. Of course. Why hadn't I thought of it before? There was what the staff workers of Friendship House called the Hermitage, that is, my room. It was so many things in one. It had a desk, a bed, a gas stove complete with oven, and a refrigerator of sorts given by the management. It even worked sometimes. The room also contained a sink and laundry, a full-grown laundry tub. Yet all in all, it was a cozy place, especially at night. I had been given a tinseled Christmas tree about 6 inches high. It was a far cry indeed from my lofty native Russian firs, so stately in their majestic beauty. The little tree, nevertheless, was nice, very nice. I had placed under it a miniature crib. When I came back from Mass, I had intended to place the infant there. Yes, the room was spick and span and very, very cozy. Why not invite the couple to spend the night there? Tomorrow I could contact the needed agencies. No sooner thought than done. My strange couple was still silent, courteously waiting for an answer that surely must have seemed to them a long time in coming, but they showed no sign of impatience. Slowly, and for some inexplicable reason rather diffidently, I invited them into the Hermitage, apologizing for its humbleness and its being many things in one. Their smiles broadened. The woman straightened herself and somehow looked taller as she pressed the child closer to her. The man voiced his thanks and proceeded to follow me. Thus we walked the 3 rather long blocks that separated the blue door from my quarters. No one said a word, yet the silence was companionable. Once in the room, I made them as comfortable as I could. The baby, finally out of its wrappings, was lovely. I had not heard it cry. The man said it was a boy, their firstborn. I made them coffee, fried some eggs, set the table, and then told them I would peek in after Mass. It was one of the most beautiful Masses I ever participated in. The thought of my 3 pilgrims snug in their cozy room probably made it so. Personal hospitality to strangers, to Christ, warms whoever who gives it so much that it is a blessing in itself. The Mass over, I rushed back to my room. To my astonishment, I found the front door ajar. This is never done in Harlem, where one uses several locks just in case. It is the same wherever there are tension, segregation, and poverty. I pushed the door open. The room was empty. The dishes had been washed and stacked away, each where it belonged. No signs of occupancy were left whatsoever. The infant that I had meant to put into its tiny crib under my tinseled tree was already there, and a candle was lit in my window. End of section 3. Stories from Donkey Bells, Advent and Christmas, Stories, Traditions, and Meditations from Doherty. Thank you for listening.